Fire Away tackles burning questions and hot topics in Canadian employment law, human resources, and dispute resolution. Hosted by Rudner Law, Fire Away is your go-to source for legal insight on the world of work. So whether you are an employee or an employer, a lawyer or an HR pro, let's ignite the conversation and get into today's episode. Here's your host, employment lawyer, mediator, and founder of Rudner Law, Stuart Rudner.
Welcome to episode 86 of Fire Away. Today we're going to be talking about cryptocurrency, financial misconduct, and corporate fraud. I'm joined by forensic accountants Edward Nagel and Avi Kamath of the Dental Consulting Group in Toronto. Very excited about this discussion. Just by way of quick background, Edward has worked in the area of corporate fraud since 1998, working with corporations, individuals, public sector and not-for-profit organizations, and their legal advisors and boards. I can personally say he's helped several of my clients over the years investigate suspected fraud, and he does so in a very thorough and methodical fashion. Also joined by Avi, who is known for his industry-specific knowledge and competency as a cryptocurrency specialist, conducting extensive research around tracing and recovery of cryptocurrency assets, which I am very excited to learn more about. So thank you both for joining me. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So I gave the highlights, but if each of you want to go into a little bit more detail as to your backgrounds, that'd be great. Avi, do you want to go first?
Sure. So my name is Avi Kamath. I'm an associate director at Delta Consulting. I'm a chartered accountant and a certified fraud examiner. And I started my career at a Big Four accounting firm in the audit group, but very quickly I realized that wasn't for me. So I joined Edward about 6 or 7 years ago in his forensic accounting practice. And at Delta, I'm the resident cryptocurrency specialist. So my expertise in this area, it really comes from my personal interest in cryptocurrency, which goes back many, many years back to my university days. And while it's true that I don't have a programming background myself, over the years, I've had opportunities to work with developers and programmers who are really very knowledgeable in this space. And I've also had opportunities to get my hands dirty, testing out different applications. But for the most part, this is just a personal hobby of mine. It's only when I joined Edward that, it was obvious to him that this is an area that's going to see growing demand from our forensic accounting profession. So he really encouraged me to sort of make this more than just a hobby and something that is professionally relevant. So that's when I started researching things that are of interest, like, how do you trace these assets? How do you recover them? And how do you safeguard them? And over the years, we've had the opportunity to work on some really unique and interesting projects. And, given recent trends, we expect to see a lot of growth in this area going forward as well.
That's very cool. I love the way that you turned the hobby into the focus of your profession. And, as they always say, if you do what you love, it's not like, it doesn't feel like you're working. So that's great. Edward, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm Edward Nagel. I'm a managing director at Delta Consulting Group. I'm a chartered professional accountant and a specialist in investigative and forensic accounting. I've been practicing for over 30 years now, 27 of which have been focused exclusively in forensics. After a few stints with the Big Four and a few accounting firms, smaller boutiques, etc., I actually launched Nagel & Associates, which was a boutique forensic firm back in the fall of 2009, which I spent 15 years at that firm. And that's where I was fortunate to be working with people like Avi, as well as various other professionals, including Cameron Piper and Sarah Dandia, all of which who I have the pleasure of working with today. And last summer, 2024, Nagel & Associates was actually acquired by Delta Consulting Group. It is a 100% employee-owned firm, which was established back in 2000, and it provides project advisory, investigations, risk mitigation, and dispute resolution services to our clients around the world.
Cool. Thank you. And yes, it's been great to know you through a few different evolutions. So I want to talk a bit about, investigations. And over the course of the years we've been doing this show, we've talked about, a few different types of, employee misconduct and fraud. A couple of episodes back, I'm forgetting which number exactly now, but 3 or 4 months ago, I guess, We talked about what I think of as the old school fraud. The people who are taking out their wife or their partner for dinner and claiming it as a client expense and that kind of thing, which is old school, low tech. But I want to talk a bit about the more traditional investigations versus the crypto side. So maybe, I don't know, Edward, if you want to start off by talking about the more traditional side, and then we can compare and contrast.
Yeah, so Stuart, when we're talking about traditional fraud and traceability, what we're normally referring to is funds flowing through traditional financial institution accounts like bank, investment, mortgage, loan, and other similar types of accounts. Now, traditional banking records are generally subject to record retention rules, which for most institutions is about 7 years. And so when you have a case that involves allegations that exceed that 7 years, it may become problematic in terms of assembling evidence on that case if those records are no longer available. But what we've seen in the last several years is that fraudsters are now increasingly turning to alternate forms of currency, specifically cryptocurrencies, to carry out their fraud schemes and to conceal their illicit gains. And what we recognized as a firm several years ago, and Avi alluded to this, is that if we don't have the skill sets and the resources to investigate cryptocurrency fraud, there are going to be a number of cases out there that we will not be able to take on. And as a result, we launched our crypto advisory services, and that's where Avi comes in. So maybe I could turn it over to you, Avi.
Yeah, I mean, Edward, as you mentioned, there's been a significant shift in fraudsters turning to cryptocurrency as a medium to carry out their fraud schemes. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of understanding of how cryptocurrencies actually work. I think most people work under the assumption that cryptocurrency transactions are anonymous, but really they're pseudonymous. And the comparison that we like to make is with social media. If you're opening an account on Twitter or Reddit, for example, you don't have to sign up with your name. You can sign up with whatever name you want. You can call yourself Fluffy Butterfly, for example. And people think that that gives you the liberty to be anonymous and say whatever you like online. But what they're missing is, if someone makes a connection to identify who's behind that account, let's say, for example, they run into your email address, suddenly all that anonymity goes out the window and everything you've said in your past can be traced and linked back to you. That same concept applies in cryptocurrency as well. And really, when you're dealing with trained investigators that know what to look for and know how to make those attributions, it's really not as anonymous as you might imagine.
Well, I think that's going to come as a surprise to a lot of people. And just in that 1-2 minute little clip there, I learned 2 new things. First of all, I learned what pseudonymous means. And I've learned that if I come across Fluffy Butterfly on Instagram, that's probably you, Avi. So what I think that's, as I said, it'll surprise a lot of people that the cryptocurrency side is not anonymous. So why is this relevant from the employer potential victim of fraud perspective? How does that change things?
So, one other concept that, is very relevant with cryptocurrency is the ability to trace. So Edward kind of mentioned it, one of the challenges we face in the traditional funds tracing world is access to records, right? That's a big challenge, is how are you going to get banking records? You have to make the requests and there might be challenges to it. So there's a whole process you need to go through. With cryptocurrency, all this information just exists out there. And if you know where to look for it, you can just help yourself and get access to it. So there is no concept of 7-year retention. And if I was a fraudster or someone that was committing tax evasion, for example, that's something that would actually keep me up at night. Because, as things move on, our tools to investigate this is just getting more and more sophisticated. So something you might have done several years ago that was clever and might go by undetected, you can look at it today and it'd be very obvious what has occurred. So we're definitely be mindful that, historical cases might resurface again. But from a business point of view, it really depends whether or not you're in the cryptocurrency space or not, because I think those present different challenges depending on what side you're in. Because if you're in the cryptocurrency space, I think there's some unique challenges that you're going to face. For example, the cryptocurrency you hold, that's vulnerable to theft. And a big driver of that is the fact that people don't understand how to properly safeguard those assets, right? And you see it all the time in the news. There's millions and millions of dollars that just get stolen away. But
how does that, getting back to your point about record retention? So let's assume that I own a cryptocurrency and someone steals it away from me. Wouldn't there be some sort of trail or ability to trace it and find out where it went?
For sure. And the breadcrumb that you'd give us to sort of start and kick that thing off would be, what is the wallet address where those funds went? That's the starting piece to any tracing analysis in cryptocurrency. And the records, they never disappear and they can't be changed. So once it's out there forever. And you could bring us a case from 7 years or 10 years ago, and we'd still be able to find out where the money ended up flowing into. And there's obviously different challenges that you might run into as you're doing that analysis, but that's very case dependent, and it really depends on what's happening in that case.
Makes sense. And so I know you were talking about some of the threats and how many people underestimate them. So you talked about businesses that are in the cryptocurrency space. So what about what I think are still the vast majority of businesses that are not, just your regular business, and what are the threats that they should be aware of?
Yeah, so we still think that, even if you're not in this space, you should be aware of how cryptocurrency is being used today. For example, I think one threat that every business out there faces, and it's a really significant one, it's ransomware. And that's when sort of maybe you click on a link that you shouldn't have, or you opened a file you shouldn't have, then all of a sudden your computer just shuts down and you get a box saying, send Bitcoin to this address, or we'll release all your private information, right?
That's just terrifying. Sorry, go ahead.
It's very terrifying. And, we're in the professional services business. We have a lot of sensitive client information as well. So it is a genuine threat even for us, right? Yes, they're just using cryptocurrency as a medium to collect the ransom. But, it's something everybody needs to be aware of, is that these kind of schemes stay out there. And, Edward mentioned that kickbacks is challenging to trace. And, when you're taking kickbacks in cryptocurrency, that's that much harder to trace as well. So you have to be cognizant that maybe your employees might turn to accepting crypto as a kickback, which might not be as obvious. And the final area where I think, there's a real risk for businesses is, when funds get misappropriated from your business or company. What we're increasingly seeing is fraudsters, the first thing they want to do is immediately convert it to cryptocurrency, because that makes it very difficult to trace. So you might, if you find yourself a victim of this type of fraud, you might go to a traditional forensic accounting firm, and they might do some initial tracing, but then they're going to hit the cryptocurrency, and then it's going to hit them like a wall. They're not going to be able to know how to take it a step further and how to guide you through that process. And that's where, as Edward mentioned, we recognized you need to be able to do both sides of the investigation to really help your clients through this.
Makes sense. And look, obviously, if you've been the victim of ransomware, that something's happened. But I want to come back for a moment to where there might be fraud. Like you said, you have a sales guy or someone else taking kickbacks, for example. Well, I guess there's two questions. One, what should organizations do to protect themselves? And then two, what are some of the red flags to look for that might alert them to some of these issues?
Edward, did you want to jump on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things you can do to prevent fraud. Now, are you speaking specifically, Stuart, of cryptocurrency or fraud in general?
I think people will be interested in both, so I would keep it general.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of red flags of fraud, Stuart, one of the things that a lot of companies don't realize is that there are certain behavioral traits or indicators that they should be looking out for in their employees. So, for example, employees or management living beyond their means. That's a huge red flag, because unless there's a source of funds that everyone's aware of, that might be an indication they're involved in some sort of fraudulent activity. Things like people who don't take vacation. It is often known that that is a red flag, because if people are not taking vacation, it's because they don't want someone else taking over their role when they're absent. Otherwise, they will uncover whatever it is that's going on. Employees who resist assistance from other employees when they're overwhelmed with work, and notwithstanding, they try to keep all the work within their confines to ensure, again, people don't get involved in what they're doing. Or people who get defensive when they're asked to provide support for a seemingly reasonable request for information and what have you. If you find transactions that have no support or lack of appropriate support, for example, that we see a lot of like credit notes and other adjustments being made where there's just simply no documentation, that could be something that should be alerting the company to investigate. Or unusual fluctuations in actual versus budgeted performance. You think you're having a great year, and all of a sudden you see the actuals, and it makes no sense given what you've actually done in the last fiscal year. So those are the kinds of things that organizations should be looking out for. In terms of prevention, one of the things that we talk about is segregation of duties. You can't have, for example, the person who sets up an employee be the same person who pays that employee, because of course those two people, if that role is being done by one person, you could easily set up a fictitious employee on your payroll. Then there's periodic spot audits, like conducting a random review of expense reports across a variety of different employees and making sure that that employee hasn't claimed inappropriate expenses. Incorporating technology into your day-to-day operations to do continuous monitoring of transactions. This is a way to not only look for red flags or unusual activity, but it also helps to mitigate a fraud becoming a much more significant impact on the organization because you're catching it much earlier. Training your employees is critical in terms of making them aware of the potential schemes that can impact their organization, because it accomplishes two things. Number one, it gives them the tools and skills that they need to identify fraud should it arise. And number two, it also sends a very strong message to the remaining employees, the potential fraudsters out there, that says everybody's now been trained on fraud awareness. And if there are fraudulent activity occurring with the organization, now people can identify them and based on their red flags. And then last but not least, it's really important that organizations, Stuart, have a mechanism for people to report concerns. So, for example, whistleblower hotline, a lot of companies are implementing these because people need to find a safe and an anonymous way to report concerns that they might have with respect to activity that might be occurring within the organization that may be illicit. There's a fear of retaliation, a fear of loss of job, and other concerns that employees have. And so companies have to encourage their employees to come forward and report those concerns.
Yeah, I've got to just quickly pick up on two of the points that you made, Edward. One is it's remarkable how often I've seen this happen where clients discover fraud that has been taking place for years, and the only reason they discover it is because the person either took a vacation or, more often than not, had to go on an unexpected leave of absence. And all of a sudden someone fills in for them and they find all of these weird things that maybe no one noticed. Or, to pick up on your last point, some people may have suspected, but they didn't report it. And in many cases, they didn't report it because they weren't sure, so they didn't want to get themselves or someone else into trouble, or they were just scared of possible reprisal. So having that whistleblower or some sort of reporting mechanism is critical. And like you said, also just not giving someone complete control over these things. As you said, either dividing up responsibilities or having more than one person involved is critical, because I've seen this a number of times over the years. So I wanted to move on to talk about how the investigations work. But Avi, I don't know if you want to add anything first on everything that Edward was talking about.
No, I think Edward did a good job covering the key points.
Well, he's been doing this for a while, so I'm not surprised he did a good job. So let's talk about this, because as over the course of the previous 85 episodes of Fireway, we've talked about investigations here and there, although in many cases it's been more on the I guess the non-financial side, investigating harassment and bullying and that kind of thing. But let's talk about, the situation where there is a red flag and an employer suspects that someone is taking kickbacks or involved in some other form of fraud. What do you recommend as a first step, and then sort of maybe take us through what the process might look like?
Sure. Maybe I can kick off, Stuart. I mean, one of the first comments to make is that every investigation is unique because the facts and circumstances of each case are based on the situation arising in each organization. So the first step for us typically is to meet with the company's management, often HR, internal counsel, and external legal counsel to talk about the allegations, to fully understand what's transpired, what do we know, who's potentially involved, and to ensure we can define the scope of this investigation appropriately from the get-go. One of the concerns, of course, in investigations is scope creep, is going too far and too wide. So we want to make sure we're not going too wide, but not going too narrow, so we avoid missing out key pieces of evidence. If to the extent the organization has done an internal investigation, the next step for us will be to review that internal investigation records, whether it be documents, notes, interview notes, or what have you, so that we can get up to speed as far as what the company knows. From there, we'll typically develop a list of preliminary information, documentation that we need to conduct the investigation based on developing a work plan and what the steps are that are needed to investigate those allegations. We will also, at that point, identify any potential source of evidence, including electronic evidence. As you know, Stuart, today, most organizations operate on some sort of electronic platform, be it servers, computers, mobile phones, or other electronic devices. And these devices typically have a plethora of potential evidence. And it's really, really critical that we preserve that evidence in a manner that potentially will be legally admissible should this matter proceed to trial. And one of the things that's really key for us as investigators is to avoid the spoliation or potential spoliation of that evidence by the company handling that electronic evidence improperly. So we focus on chain of custody and making sure you have the appropriate professionals, like a computer forensic professional, securing that evidence in a manner that will eventually be admissible in court. We'll then conduct our analysis, reviewing banking records, accounting records, supporting documentation, invoices from clients, from vendors. We'll put together that analysis, probably conduct some interviews, and then even put together some sort of reporting or affidavit setting out the findings of our analysis. And if needed, we may be required to testify in court as experts and provide evidence before court. So in a nutshell, that's really the sort of high-level cradle-to-grave review process.
Yeah, I know we can go into a lot more detail, but that's really helpful. And I'm glad you mentioned at the beginning getting counsel involved, because it really is critical to have that plan. And then, as you know, because we've worked together a few times, and I like to be involved at the beginning to lay out the plan and the strategy, and then I'll usually take a step back and let the experts like yourselves do the investigation, because I don't want to be involved in investigating or fact finding. I want to be the one advising the client, and I certainly don't want to become a witness, which I think some lawyers fall into the trap of getting too involved in the investigation, where they can become a witness in some cases. So glad you mentioned that. And I'm also really glad you mentioned the whole issue of spoliation, which for listeners or viewers who don't know, essentially, it sounds like spoliation. People pronounce it different ways. Basically, it means just spoiling the evidence. But I know, because I see this all the time, I'll have a client call and say, well, I suspect this, or I think so-and-so is doing that. And either I'm going to start going through all their emails and their files, or they tell me they've already done that. So I think it'd be good to take a minute just to explain, what you're talking about and why it's a bad idea to start going through the person's laptop and email and everything else.
Yeah, so I can comment on it, and I can actually ask Avi as well, because he gets involved in the crypto side of the investigations, and there are unique aspects of that as well when it comes to preserving the evidence. But When it comes to computers, computers have a footprint. It has logs of activity. And the minute you turn on that computer, it is already writing against that log. And so if you have an employee that's terminated as of, say, Monday, and you've got activity showing on that computer as of Tuesday, then it will follow that someone will accuse the company of potentially putting evidence on that computer to essentially plant evidence, so to speak, or to try to support the allegations that have been raised against that employee. So what we typically recommend for our clients, Stuart, is that if there is a corporate issue computer, let's say, just to keep the example available, to secure that computer, power it down immediately, and secure it in a locked office or cabinet for which the individual who has custody of that computer has full control and custody at all times. So what that does is it maintains chain of custody over that computer until the appropriate professionals are available to attend on site to take a forensic or a mirror image of that hard drive and then be able to conduct our analysis on a working copy of the image of that hard drive, never touching the original. So when a company does try to start looking at the computer, and the computer forensic professionals actually start looking at it, they tell us, oh, by the way, there looks like there's 2 weeks worth of activity post the employee leaving. That's not good news. And in fact, Stuart, I've seen cases where there are folders that are set up on the computer called fraud, and the company is assembling evidence that they have identified on this original computer into this folder they've now set up. And guess what's going to happen to all that evidence that they've just compiled?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a great smoking gun if you actually find a folder called fraud that was there beforehand, but that seems unlikely.
That's right.
But I just wanted to follow up on one thing, because I know you talked about how, even when you turn on the computer, it has a footprint and there's a record of that. But the other thing that I remember coming across years ago was, and this was specifically in the context of a Microsoft Word document, is, as soon as you open the document, of course, the metadata changes and things change. So maybe you could comment, either you or Avi, comment a little bit on why you don't want to even open a document.
Yeah, I can certainly kick off and then pass it off to Avi. But I mean, file properties, as you mentioned, Stuart, documents have metadata and they maintain file properties. So if you open up any Word document today and you click on file properties, it will tell you who the author of the document was. It'll tell you when it was last modified, when it was last saved, when it was created. And very often we rely on that data because, for example, if an employee is creating a fictitious vendor invoice and submitting that invoice for payment to their company as if they were a bona fide vendor, you may end up being lucky and finding that the file properties show that individual to be the author of that document. And if that document has not been spoiled and it remains on the computer, on the corporate issue computer, and then you find a hard copy of it, it's been approved by that employee, you now have the sequence of events, the timeline showing the individual creating it and then printing it out and submitting it for payment, say from an external website. If you go in and open that document, you're now starting to modify those dates. And it may, in fact, you could even go in and modify the author of the document, in which case you lose the value of that evidence. Avi, do you have any other thoughts in terms of, from the crypto side, preservation of evidence and how important that is?
Yeah, so I mean, Edward and I are actually working on a case where this very matter is front and center. The client has gone in and reviewed a device which is at the center of the investigation, and we were kind of brought in after the fact to come in and sort of help review it. And really that has complicated what should have been an easy investigation. The evidence on that device is quite compelling, but because of the fact that there are now these concerns of spoliation, we might not be able to directly rely on it. So we're having to do alternative procedures to satisfy ourselves that nothing really did get changed, or even conduct procedures to sort of come to the same conclusion without directly relying on this evidence. So it's just a matter of, something that should have been quite easy, open and shut case has now become much more complex by the client trying to do their own investigation. And Edward, just on the blockchain type of thing, like when you're trying to preserve records, There's different ways. One of the unique things with cryptocurrency transactions in particular, there's nothing you really need to do to preserve it. Like all the records are out there publicly available. And that's really one of the properties of cryptocurrencies as well, is the data is immutable, which means, nobody can go and change it after the fact. So at least from that point of view, it's a little easier to get your data.
Yeah, and it's interesting. 'Cause one of the things I'm getting out of all this is, although it may seem like cryptocurrency is the better way to cover your tracks if you're engaging in misconduct, it sounds like in some ways it's actually worse because it might be easier to discover the evidence if you know how.
I think that's the biggest challenge, is finding out how to do it, right? So, but you're exactly right. Like in some ways, it does make it easier if you know what to look for.
All right. Well, as I say, I think almost every episode, the time is flying by far quicker than we would have expected. But a couple of minutes left, and I know you guys want to talk a little bit about the use of AI. Yeah, how does AI relate, or how can it be used in this context?
Yeah, so Stuart, I mean, AI is a buzzword that's very much being used loosely these days, and AI, or artificial intelligence, as it's commonly referred to, is when computers or machines are designed to think, learn, and make decisions like humans. So, for example, AI is being used for self-driving cars to detect roads and traffic and obstacles. What we're now starting to see, though, is organizations are now incorporating AI into their day-to-day operations. So in the context of fraud, we as investigators are using tools, for example, e-discovery, electronic discovery tools, where we can import huge volumes of data and analyze that data much more quicker and efficiently than we used to do on, effectively in a manual basis. But historically, even these tools could do simple keyword searches, date searches, and individual searches by name, and that was the output. Now these tools are becoming much more sophisticated, to the point where you can start looking for patterns, relationships, connections that you wouldn't otherwise see through simple keyword searches. So it's making investigations much more efficient. On the company side, what we're seeing is organizations incorporating tools that can do continuous monitoring of transactions within their accounting system, flagging potential, what we call red flags of potential inappropriate or illicit activity, and then bringing those to the attention of individuals within the organization to potentially initiate an investigation. So they say that prevention rather than detection is the best deterrent against fraud. So what these tools are now doing is they're now learning from all of this data, and they are becoming more preventative because they're able to identify where potential fraud exposure exists within the organization based on its history of activity, and allows the company in turn to make modifications to either its policies and procedures or its internal controls to mitigate that risk before the fraud impacts the organization. So it's having a huge, huge impact on organizations in general as they're adopting this type of technology.
That's amazing, and it sounds like for most organizations that could be an amazing tool that allows you to be prevent the fraud, as you said, rather than wait to try to detect it.
Yeah. And when it comes to cryptocurrency, Stuart, I can tell you that Avi can share with you in terms of how AI is being used in our cryptocurrency investigations, because this just shows and highlights how important technology has become. Avi, maybe you could just share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think when you're reviewing data in cryptocurrency, there's two challenges. One, it's ugly to look at, ugly and unfamiliar. And two is you're very likely going to be dealing with a huge volume of data. Today, we have tools that sort of help you on both aspects. So they're able to crunch through a large volume of data, boil it down into simple graphs that anybody can follow. And that really goes a long way. And it's also sophisticated enough to make connections between different parties. And sort of, we mentioned right at the start that making attributions, that's how tracing works in cryptocurrency. And now you have tools that can help you in those aspects. So yeah, AI is definitely making cryptocurrency investigations easier as time goes on.
Fascinating. Before I take my turn to fire away, where can people find you guys if they wanted to get in touch with you?
So you can find us, Stuart, at our website is delta-cgi.com, where you'll find our profiles, our bios, as well as our contact information. So that's delta-cgi.com.
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you both again for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
All right, and now I will take my turn to fire away. Okay, so I want to talk about why DIY and investigations just don't mix. Here's a typical scenario. Client calls me, they tell me that they believe that one of their employees is engaged in some sort of fraud. I explain the need to investigate properly and efficiently and fairly and thoroughly. And they tell me that they've got the employee's laptop, they're pretty sure the evidence is there, they're just going to go through it themselves, see what they find, and then we'll decide if it's worth pursuing. As Edward and Avi explained in episode 86 of Fire Away, simply by turning a computer on, you change the data. Opening a file changes the file properties. All these things damage the evidence and basically mean that you may not be able to rely upon the evidence to prove what you otherwise could have proven. Opening a file is damaging evidence, and all of a sudden that smoking gun that you had is no longer valid evidence. As they explained in a case that they worked on recently, the evidence to prove what happened was right there. But because of the fact that the company owner or HR person, I forget who, had opened the files, they had to do extensive additional work just to be able to prove what they otherwise could have proven with the files that were just right there on the hard drive. It ended up costing the company a lot more money and it weakened their case. So imagine, this is the worst case scenario, imagining that not only did you find out that one of your employees was engaged in fraud and stole a lot of money, but imagine now that you fire them, they sue for wrongful dismissal, and you lose because you damaged the evidence. And now, not only did they steal from you, you've got to pay them their severance. If a company finds you really acted badly, you might pay additional damages for bad faith, and you're going to have to pay them for part of their legal fees in addition to all of your own legal fees. So that's why it's critical that when you have this type of situation, you have the laptop or the hard drive, whatever it is, you lock it up right away, bring in an expert, let them make a copy that they can use as their working copy to go through the evidence without damaging the original. That original can then be used in litigation to help you prove your allegations and ideally to win your case. Similarly, in harassment cases, it's amazing how often I get calls from clients or potential clients who insist on doing the investigation themselves. And usually that means someone who has no training in investigating or interviewing witnesses is the one who's tasked with this. In many cases, it's a credibility issue. And the conclusion that I see in the final report is that it was a quote-unquote he said, she said, and they can't decide what happened. That is a complete failure to investigate. It also creates evidence that will now undermine your case, because what I will tell them is we've got to get a proper investigator in, do a proper investigation, and that investigator will reach a conclusion. The problem is that first report is still going to be evidence that you have to produce in litigation. So now, even though you have a very strong report from your expert saying that they find that the allegations were substantiated, you've also got this document by someone who quote unquote investigated saying they couldn't decide what happened. That's going to undermine your case. So all these things are just examples of why I say that DIY and investigations don't mix. As my wife would say, it's kind of like me and home repairs. Focus on what you do best. Bring in the investigators who know what they're doing to investigate properly, give you the evidence so that you can act as you should and not undermine your case. That's all for today. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you agree, spread the word. If you don't, please tell me why. So that's a wrap for episode 86 of Fire Away. Thank you all for tuning in, and please let us know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed the episode, hit the subscribe button and also follow us on social media to keep up with Canadian employment laws, news, and updates. Also, you can catch new episodes of Fire Away on the third Tuesday of every month, wherever you find your podcasts. I want to thank, first of all, Edward and Avi for joining me on episode 86 for a really interesting discussion. And as always, thank you to Mark and Rebecca for their work behind the scenes. And finally, to quote one of my favorite hockey broadcasters, the pleasure was all ours.
At Rudner Law, we want people to treat their employment relationships as legal relationships and make informed decisions rather than assumptions. Keep up to date on Canadian employment law issues by following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and signing up for our newsletter. Past episodes can be found on YouTube, on our website, and archived on Facebook. And if you like our page or subscribe to our channel, you will receive notifications when the episodes are live. As we always say, none of that replaces legal advice tailored to your specific circumstances. If you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us.